So um, covered as a slew of movies. It wasn't as noticeable, although I recognized that he worked on, but now it looks like sort of a return. It also looks like I kind of misnamed it. Maybe I got a bit of my head of myself. The biggest film of '85 and a seminal piece on time travel. Back to the Future is a film that defied expectations, outlasted hiccups, and common folk alike will attest that the triumph of Back to the Future lies in the haphazardly constructed but brilliantly designed time-traveling DeLorean. By this point, I'm sure an early draft of the script before the DeLorean was even in play. Bob Gale, who penned the screenplay with Robert Zemeckis, elaborates. The early version of the script, the time machine was actually built. Zemeckis is wearing his director's hat instead of his writer's hat. He started to weigh the complications of all the scenes already Back to the Future. He came in my office one morning and said, "Hey Bob, there's a lot of logistics with hauling this refrigerator around. What if Doc Brown been smart enough to make the time machine mobile?" I said, "Why a DeLorean?" Because it was infamous, Zemeckis remarks. DeLorean was on trial for cocaine trafficking, Argentine's final decision. The car looked so cool to begin with, but now there's the notoriety of DeLorean's association with it. For about 15 seconds, we were concerned whether or not Universal. Gil adds it just wasn't as cool. While DeLorean was acquitted of the charges in '84, his legal misfortunes had only just begun. Soon went on trial for fraud. The scandal wasn't the only alluring aspect, though. Zemeckis continues. It has a stainless steel body, an absolutely shitty car. Driving around in such it was miserable to work with. But the science fiction component was going to look like. How named Probert, he was really focused on doing all the storyboards. While working on the boards, he wanted to take a stab at the DeLorean, and he did. This guy, Doc Brown, had actually built it himself in his garage. Together we decided to needed to hire a specific kind of artist to figure out the engineering. We had met Cobb when we were working with Million of Humor. It was a real shock when I met him in the pre-production offices of Conan and saw how much more he was capable of. Not to mention, he was such a charming and personal guy and had ideas. Talent comes at a cost, and for the Back to the Future team, they're willing to pony up the dough for a highly coveted Cobb design pass. Our first Cobb, as excited and Zemeckis and Gale were, Cobb's attachment to the project wasn't welcomed by everyone at first. Since they didn't pick me as the designer for the DeLorean, I wasn't expecting to like him. Gentle, generous, and just so easy to like. Taking clock in place, there wasn't a lot of time for an exploratory period, but Zemeckis wasn't phased. I wasn't concerned about the then you turn it over and let them work. Ron came up with some very inspired stuff in a very short time frame. There's a faith in the process, and you hope for the best. Nothing can be assured, but putting the door opens and it looks like a spaceship. That's more of my concern than what it looked like as a time machine. In my mind, that was completely arbitrary. Unlike his experience on Alien, Cobb's perversely said if it's going to be nuclear powered, it needs to have a nuclear reactor. And if it's going to have a nuclear reactor, it's going to need a vent. Just like any power plant, they have cooling vents. That's why he inserted the giant vent that working with Rod, such an inspiring experience, made the designs of the DeLorean to tell the story, and we absolutely fell in love with it. Gale explains. Even when Rob designs future hardware, it looks understandable. So why my initial designs weren't. He goes out and finds it, buys it, scavenges it. It was exactly as Ron was presenting in his layout. Production to work alongside someone he respected. The budget of the film was a fraction of the big budget pictures he had worked on before. Cobb always saw the value in aiding people who had great ideas and boundless enthusiasm to help people out when they're trying to get low-budget ideas off the ground. Steve Berg, now a known concept artist and illustrator, was given a life-changing opportunity by Cobb during the pre-production. It was being produced by the same company that was doing Jocks. And someone happened to say, oh, Ron Cobb has to go another project, and we've got to find someone who can design. On Saturday, I went to his house and spent hours talking about design, about life, about everything. Really, it was a big turning point in my life. So yeah, I've never, maybe in one of their best of the worst. They're skipping around in time a bit. Maybe that's why I thought we were getting into 7 years after Ripley squared off against the mighty xenomorph on the Nostromo. She returned with a vengeance in what many consider one of the best action films of all time, to explore a new direction instead of reskinning the first film. The film still featured, well, I'd say some of the tension and terror of Alien. Cameron expertly added some of Ron's work from Star Wars early on. I really realized there was this guy named Ron Cobb who was doing these very cool designs. It was in the wake of the release of Alien. It was in '79, a time where as fiction work at that time. In '81, Ron's compilation book, Color Vision, was released. It featured a number of the interiors and exteriors he had done on Alien. Immediately, Cameron's passion for design, as well as his well-read understanding of the film's vision and intent, was an integral part of the early stages. About the designs for the film, I do that part and parcel with my writing process. I went to work looking through all my old books, any printed media I could get my hands on, including periodicals like engineering-based hardware. I can look at it and quickly get a sense of how it works, what it does, why it's there. Ridley made a brilliant decision when casting Ron Cobb as a designer, casting that which is inexplicable, which has disturbing inhuman quality with Cobb's well-referenced rectilinear designs, or as I just call it, plausible hardware. I called Ron at Vera's house in Santa Monica and looked at more of his design work and talked about his process and how it worked. We really just hit it off. Ron and I had a shared passion for engineering and physics. While I never studied engineering of Aliens off the heels of his first hit film, The Terminator. And unlike his experience on Terminator, like Cobb, actually designed that myself, the aircraft, the weapons, the hunter colors, and even the Terminator himself. This was another common connection Ron had. We're both artists who saw film and narrative in a very similar way. Ron's and Cameron's artistic mind meld made for a collaborative back and forth to achieve the end result. As a fellow designer, sometimes I'd give Ron a sketch to work from. Ron called the process repackaging. Classic and sent it back to me. Part of this process was about making it buildable. Ron's focus was on tangible designs that an art department could take and build. Ron's designs weren't gestural or highly was a key element to his work on Aliens. He saw it, he knew what it needed to look like to tell the story. Film design is more engineering, it's narrative. Ron understood that design had, if you're on a spacecraft, it looked like a spacecraft. There's something familiar about it. Regardless, there was always a push toward a whimsy or narrative idea in his designs. A longtime friend and collaborator, as well as aerospace engineer who worked at General Dynamics on the Tomahawk cruise missile, designer of the Stealth Cruise missile system, Michael Burtz explains, if you recall, the landing ship comes down and Marines go out in this mobile tank-like would have, and so on. Then they actually built one for the film. It was unlike anyone had ever seen. I think the military looked at that and interact vehicles. Imagine a matrix where you could say, here's the platform that would build that underlies the weapon system. Then you can add different modules for different missions. Ron was thorough in describing all the different applications. Burt's reveals Cobb's ideas can be commonly seen in what many car companies are doing today, putting different parts on top of that. So you're only building one propulsion and control system and then have different modules you can put on for different vehicles. Guess they. 2 years after Aliens, Cobb and Cameron once again came together for his science fiction epic, The Abyss. The film was a demanding undertaking. Oil rig was one of Cobb's crowning design achievements. On the film, as Cameron attests, it was Cobb's view, the front view, left and right side. I mean, it was basically giving us working drawings. Most designers don't do that. They let the art department figure it out. He was in the upper tier of top designers because he wasn't satisfied. Once again joining Cobb in the art department was Steve Berg. Echoes Cameron's observation on had a unique approach to design, where he would often do orthographic views like plans, information Ron was instilling in his pieces. Working with him over several years, I absorbed an enormous amount of knowledge just from being around him. Berg's long-standing rect. Ron was a very funny guy who always encouraged levity over anxiety. I remember one day, no time to learn, I'm just gonna have to fake it again. Cobb's design of Decor 2 was further dictated by narrative elements involving an experimental visual effects element. Cameron illuminates, we gave a little trial flow path for the pseudopod to travel through when it rose out of the moon pool and began to curiously explore the rig. Since the Abyss featured principal photography and nuclear power station, with a capacity equal to about 11 Olympic swimming pools, among many daunting challenges underwater production demanded, there was also an aesthetic. We had to create functional props that would keep an actor alive. Ron was not only designing a helmet that looked plausible, it had to work. We first looked at the spherical spacesuit-looking helmets, but I quickly realized I'd find a way to bend the acrylic. Ron then came up with this idea, this cross shape of a single piece of acrylic. It was then bent so it had these radius corners. It took it out of the building the working helmet, and they said, yeah, that'll work. As long as you have those flat windows, you won't get that pinhead effect. Another key question, string of lights or LEDs inside the helmet. Nobody in their right mind would put a light inside a helmet. You wouldn't be able to see anything. Ron suggested putting inside and 20 or 30% of the light came off the beam splitter and came down out of the bottom of the light through a little diffuser shown in the top window of the helmet. Very natural. There's the kind of shit Ron and I were able to work out together. The designs for the helmets got published, the helmets got made, tested, and no one died. Helmet designs was so revelatory and impacted future diving helmets. Total Recall. Viewing in 1990, Total Recall is a film filled with colonial red planet, dreamscapes, advanced technology, and of course clouds. Was new to the US and unaware of Cobb's work. I'd only been in the United States for a couple of years when I was hired to do Total Recall, Verhoeven recalled. I needed a lot of feedback from the production team to indicate who we should do. That suggested the idea. I was presented with a handful of his drawings and was floored by the innovative approach he took to science fiction. Cobb's first assignment was to design the recall machine. Continues. Talented crew members like Ron, I try to give them a lot of freedom, makes the relationship less about executing just what I want and gives the ability to add bits of what they want to. Convey what needs the film required, and Ron would scamper back to his desk and turn over these beautiful designs. Let's look at the artwork, look on what we had in mind. When it came to conceptualizing the colony on Mars, Cobb was part of the team who went over to NASA to present the current designs and their standpoint. Will the buildings be built? Where would they be placed? How would the radiation affect the settlement? The result was a middle ground between science and fiction. NASA brought up that most of the buildings would likely be placed in canyons to avoid direct exposure to the amount of exposure. You can see of the Johnny cab was another favorite of the directors. We knew we were going to use a Volkswagen as the base for the car, Verhoeven explains, so Ron's concept was formulated around that. And this way, harkening back to the cars that were built in the 30s, yet the car is fully automated and run by a robot. This juxtaposition of modern and vintage elements was something Ron had a firm grasp on, confirmed by Schwarzenegger's shape. We built the cars real tall so Arnold could get in them with other people and a cameraman hanging on to the side. So it was really necessary to have a lot of room for shittiness and debauchery. Cobb braved the path and delivered the initial concept that served as a backbone for the final look. It's a bit of a bordello, or as we'd call it in Amsterdam, the red light district. The red light district of Mars, filmed with mutated a bit decay due to the sort of businesses happening there and the constant traffic. The mole, an imposing drilling machine, was used to excavate tunnels. The initial fabrication was a real gut punch. Forget the company who built it, but we were waiting for it. And this thing shows up, shipped across the border that looked like hell. It was a frame on some kind of screen ready. It was all hands on deck. We stripped it, but kept the frame. I brought down truckloads and truckloads of parts, just background shapes, pistons, bearings, just stuff. I put 2 art directors on it. We completed the vacuum form shop worked constantly for shapes for walls, and also the drilling machine. It was pretty much a communal, desperate effort. This Cobb's directorial debut, Garbo, didn't quite stick the landing. In fact, one critic even called it a certified stinker. Served as Cobb's inspiration. Nothing really is a project of circumstance. Robin Love explains after word filtered out that Spielberg in order to pitch a project at Cannes. Others didn't eventuate, mostly because the scripts were weak. The stars of Garbo were Neil Gladwin and Stephen Kearney, comic duo who had a very successful fringe stage. There was some physical comedy and lots of pained silences and awkward stares. It did work. It got a great response at the Edinburgh film, which was then given to Ron as a directing project. I was dead keen to have a year in Australia, so perhaps I egged him on a little too much to accept it. With Cobb's vast experience writing too, the second problem was their act didn't perfectly translate into their portrayal as garbage collectors. Ron said later there needed to be more physical comedy, which was lacking. Perhaps stunt guys should have been employed. When Ace Ventura was for the world's briefest release, I think one of the drawbacks of Ron being a really nice and very kind person, found it very difficult to criticize people, and perhaps it was very hard for him to tell Neil and Stephen. So yeah, it just looks back up here, perhaps tomorrow. Surprising amount of stuff left. Mork Borg.